Before we start, drop 2 quick answers in the comments so I know who is here with us. What city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Keep your clock in mind, because this story runs on ledgers, keys, and delivery windows, and the difference between 9:15 and 9:20 can decide who owns a future. The orphanage ledger looked harmless. It was wrapped in blue cloth and tied with a ribbon the color of church carpet. On the front, someone had written, "Gifts and Dowers. Neat hand, steady pressure." Inside, every line paired a young woman's name with a small sum of money and something the clerk called a bond. The girls were all adults on paper, 18 and up by the time their row received a number. The money did not come from suitors. It came from a charitable society that called itself the Ladies' Benevolent Exchange. The exchange said it gave orphan girls a starter dowry so they would not be at the mercy of men who counted every penny twice. 2 weeks after a girl signed, a man from the exchange arrived with a notary and a sealed envelope for a physician. The notary stamped the bond. The physician's envelope went out by night mail. The envelope always came back with a certificate that said "fit for marriage," and a second page the exchange called a receipt of propriety. After that, the bond could be sold. They called it assigning the dowry. In court, they called it a lien. If that sounds technical, that is the point. The exchange learned to turn dignity into paperwork that would obey a stamp. They did not need bruisers. They needed clerks, a notary, a photographer who worked for the courthouse on civil days, and a doctor who traveled under a civic banner. 3 signatures and a ribbon made any objection look impolite. What the exchange sold was not romance or even a match. It was priority. A buyer with a bond had the first right to a girl's time and movements until the bond was satisfied. The paper used polite phrases. Keep evenings accounted for. Keep letters available for review. Submit to verification if any dispute arises. It read like a household budget. It behaved like a contract on a body. May Donovan did not hear about the exchange from a courtroom. She heard about it from a pawn counter the way she usually found rot in neat towns. A man came in with a tin of ribbon and a paper with 2 seals, pressed so deep you could feel the metal underneath. He said he wanted a short loan against a charitable bond. The pawnbroker had seen plenty of paper, war claims, life policies, tickets on sewing machines, but never a dowry bond that named a specific person as collateral. He opened the tin. Inside lay a narrow receipt, handwritten in a clerk's practice script. Receipt for custodial right to time and conduct. Series C, assignment pending. The pawnbroker did not like the smell of it. He closed the tin and wired Donovan at the post office, because she was the one who handled sealed things that should not be moving around at night. Donovan set the tin, the paper, and the pawn ticket on a table in the sorting room after hours, and studied the seals. The notary seal belonged to a man she knew from marriage licenses. The other was a blind emboss used by the exchange, a circle with a dove and a motto about virtue. The ribbon was cut on a bias and smelled faintly of store starch. On the back of the bond, in pencil, was a code the pawnbroker had not noticed. R12, Chapel Night. She had seen that kind of pencil code before. It meant the paper was meant to be moved at an event where people wanted to look generous and did not want to sign for anything. The name on the bond was Nora Hale. She worked as a seamstress 2 floors up over a grocer and paid rent to a widow who ran a clean house and minded her own business until the mail pushed its way under the door. Nora had been at the orphanage until she turned 18. The exchange came that year with a speech about opportunity and a blue ribbon. They called it a bridge to marriage for girls without fathers to negotiate for them. The paperwork said the gift would never be called in unless the household fell into distress. Nora signed because the matron said every girl signed, and because it felt wrong to be the only one in the doorway, shaking her head, while the others lined up with soft hands and hopeful faces. 3 months later, on a Tuesday, Nora received her first letter from the exchange. It congratulated her on completing her medical form and noted that her bond had entered assignment consideration. It said that a respectable household had expressed interest in supporting her advancement. It asked her to report any changes to her hours, acquaintances, or correspondence, so the exchange could write reassuring things to suitors and employers. It was not a threat. It was an introduction to supervision. The doctor named on her file was a man called Avery who wore a frock coat and a neat beard and wrote certificates that sounded like civic speeches. He practiced out of rooms he rented by the week near train stations. He did not prod or make a scene. He asked questions and wrote answers on a printed form that had boxes for fever and faintness and a line for monthly regularity that made Nora's jaw tighten. He pressed a blind seal with a motto into the bottom corner and handed the envelope to the exchange's runner in front of her so she would not think she owned any part of it. The runner put the envelope into a canvas mailbag and left without a farewell. The photographer was worse because he behaved as if the whole arrangement existed to make his day easier. He put Nora in front of a velvet backdrop and told her to tilt her chin to avoid glare on the jaw. She had a small scar there from a childhood dog bite that never fully faded. He had her hold a ledger for a pose he called the diligent daughter. He snapped 2 plates and sent her home. Nora had never seen the photographs. She would learn later they did not belong to her. They belonged to the file. Caleb Vance, a baker's assistant who had plans larger than his apron, liked Nora and told her so with the careful confidence of a man who counted sugar by the ounce. He had been saving to open a counter of his own. He wrote to Nora on paper that smelled faintly of yeast and asked whether everyone at the seam room liked her as much as he did. She wrote back with straight answers. She did not write about the exchange because she thought it would sound small to bring up a gift when she wanted to talk about work and plans. The exchange wrote to Caleb 2 weeks later. They were glad to hear of his interest. They had a bond in place to support Nora's household stability. They enclosed a pamphlet about modern dowry practices. They did not ask his permission to be in the conversation. They told him what the conversation was. Donovan read her way into the room because she had learned that the perfect crime in a polite town uses the post. She asked the postmaster to pull all mail from the exchange to see which letters had return privileges and which carried a second envelope inside. She found 3. 2 were to landlords with achieving written in a hand that did not know embarrassment. The third was to Nora's employer, noting that her bond would be presented for assignment at a chapel night, and reminding the employer to keep Nora's schedule tidy so sponsors would feel comfortable. The postmaster, who hated the way people used long words to hide simple truths, turned the envelope upside down and said, "This is conscription with ribbons." What the exchange called chapel night was a private meeting dressed in public clothes, a church auxiliary room, a banner that said benefit, a table with water, a piano bench, and 3 trays with keys. Applicants came in through one door, buyers through another. The notary sat between them like a patient accountant. A buyer paid the exchange's assignment fee, signed a paper that gave him the first right to a girl's time until the bond matured, and received a bundle, a copy of the doctor's certificate, a court photographer's print, and a letter of reassurance to show an employer or a mother to prove he had the exchange behind him. If the girl kept quiet, the buyer was said to be protecting her. If she made a scene, the buyer was said to be withdrawing support and given a letter to deliver that would make any landlord think twice. Nora did not learn about chapel night from the exchange. She learned about it from a grocer's boy who swept the auxiliary room between events and noticed that the velvet curtains smelled like stovetop wax on Thursdays. The boy told Nora's landlady, who told Nora's aunt, who told Nora that she was going to make a mistake by keeping her head down. Nora made a decision the exchange had not planned for. She went to the chapel door before anyone else and watched the volunteers carry in the trays. She noted the position of the 3 keys and the way the notary kept his hand near a cigar case. She had seen a cigar case like that somewhere. It took a minute to remember. The pawn tin. The pawnbroker had set one on the table when Donovan came by. Donovan did more than watch. She sent a card to the exchange offering them a speaking slot at a new domestic economy demonstration the post office was hosting. It would be an honor if the exchange would explain dowries to the public, she wrote, and show how their process protected girls. She proposed a date that fell the day after chapel night. She wanted their trays inside a federal room while the seals were still warm. The exchange accepted. Of course they did. They thrived on appearing official. She also walked into the notary's office during open hours and purchased 4 blank acknowledgments for a hypothetical marriage settlement. The notary's clerk took cash and stamped without looking at names. Donovan noted the feel of the stamp and the way the dove in the exchange's blind emboss bit a tiny dead zone near the rim where the die was misaligned. She pocketed the acknowledgments and left before anyone asked why a postal inspector needed marriage forms. Nora made her own lever. She borrowed a ribbon spool from work, slid a 2-inch piece under the knot of the exchange's blue tie on her file when the clerk looked away, and pressed her fingernail into the wax smear where the ribbon's ends overlapped. The exchange loved seals because seals made arguments feel over. Nora planned to follow hers. She told Caleb 2 things. Do not answer any letter from the exchange. If anyone asks about evenings, say you spend them staring at ovens. He laughed and then saw she was not joking. He promised. He also asked whether he should come with her to the chapel. She said no, not because she did not want him there, because men in rooms like that make stories explode in 10 seconds, and she needed this one to unfold. The plan was simple. Donovan would watch the route and take the trays when the exchange brought them to the post office. Nora would watch the clerk's hands at chapel night and see who touched her ribbon. If the bond was assigned, the exchange would send a reassurance letter to someone. That letter would go through the mail. That was Donovan's jurisdiction. If the exchange was bluffing, the notary would make a mistake because people who bluff for a living get lazy. Either way, paper would move. Paper does not lie. Chapel night smelled like beeswax and starch. The auxiliary women laid out hymnals to make the room feel less like a private sale. The notary sat with his cigar case and a purse of change for men who did not like to carry bills. The doctor's runner put envelopes in a stack by policy number. The court photographer set a wooden frame on the piano bench with 2 cabinet prints already inside. Nora's name never appeared on the wall. It appeared on a slip tucked into a tray with a key and a number. She watched the steward look at that slip and then look at a man in a good coat who had been standing at the window counting his fingers. She knew that look from the shop. It was the look of someone about to claim something that did not belong to him in words that sounded like help. The steward announced the first assignment. A girl from the laundry, 21 by the ledger. A man from an ice house, bond to be applied to household equipment. Applause and nods, a handshake, a signature, a photographer's flash. The second assignment moved faster. The third went to a man whose wife wore a brooch shaped like a dove. When the steward lifted the tray with Nora's ribbon, a hand came down on it that was not the buyer's. It was the notary's. He covered the corner of the paper with 2 fingers and slid the cigar case open with his thumb. The case had a lining with a slit. Something small lived there, a key. He used it to pop a lock on a tin under the table and swapped a slip inside. He was not just stamping, he was managing stock. Nora saw the swap because she was not supposed to be there, and because people who run systems forget to hide movements from women who clean up after them. She memorized the new number on the slip when the notary lifted his hand. It matched the pencil code on the pawn tin. R12, Chapel Night. The buyer signed. The steward pushed the tray across. The doctor's runner added the envelope. The photographer called for a pose that made the man look upright and the paper look heavy. The auxiliary sang 3 polite notes to cover the noise of a lock closing. Then the meeting ended with hands and smiles. Donovan waited in the sorting room the next evening. The exchange arrived with trays, ribbon papers, and the bright look of people who think they are about to be praised in print. Donovan thanked them for agreeing to educate the public. She asked them to set their process on the table and demonstrate how a dowry bond protected a girl. The steward set down 3 keys and a stamp. The notary placed his cigar case on the edge of the table where he could reach it without thought. The doctor's runner stacked the envelopes. The court photographer adjusted his frame and set a velvet backdrop on a chair to look busy. Donovan held up the pawn tin and read the pencil code under the lid. Then she lifted the exchange's stamp and pressed her own tiny witness bite on its rim with a jeweler's tool. If the exchange tried to swap stamps later, the missing bite would tell the story without a word. She did not announce the bite. She set the stamp down, smiled, and asked the notary to show the audience how a bond is assigned when no one is being forced. He opened the cigar case and reached for a key. The notary's hand paused over the cigar case for half a second when Donovan said, "Audience." It was long enough for the room to understand that what was about to happen mattered. He took out a small brass key with a crisp cut, the kind that fits one thing and lives nowhere else. He smiled for the auxiliary women as if this were a harmless lesson. He slid the key into a tin under the table, turned it, and lifted the lid. Inside, slips with numbers, blue ribbons cut to length, and 3 folded acknowledgments already stamped with his seal, names left blank. He had prepared assignments in advance. That told Donovan 2 things. First, Chapel Night was not a negotiation. Second, the notary did not need a buyer to be present to move paper. Donovan did not spread accusations. She asked for a demonstration of best practice. The steward obliged. He set a bond on the table and called it a pledge to peace. The doctor's runner placed an envelope on top and called it verification. The photographer stood up to arrange light and called his frame dignity. The notary filled 2 blanks with a speed that comes only from repetition. He never looked up when he wrote the girl's name. He covered the lower corner of the bond with his other hand as he reached for the stamp, as if he were protecting modesty. He was protecting serial numbers. Donovan watched his wrist angle. She saw the habit of a man who hides the part of a paper that ties it to a second paper in a different room. Nora stood at the back with her aunt and the pawnbroker who had started this. When the notary pressed the stamp and lifted his hand, She saw the dove emboss catch the light with a dead zone at the edge. The same flaw Donovan had felt on blank forms in the notary's office. The same bite mark Donovan had just added to the exchange's stamp. The notary had two tools that looked alike in a stack on his right. He was about to swap them without moving his shoulder. That is a trick that only works when you believe no one is watching. Caleb stayed near the postmaster's desk, where the ledger lay open. He had one job he trusted himself to do without making trouble. He was to watch for anything moving into a mailbag without a line in the book. When the doctor's runner started to slide a bundle of envelopes toward the back door, Caleb raised his hand, not loud, not angry, just enough. The postmaster looked up and said, "We log in the light." The runner pulled his hand back. Small correction, large effect. Donovan advanced the demonstration by asking simple questions that forced each man to say out loud what he pretended he was not doing. Who selects the buyer? Who holds the bond between selection and assignment? Who keeps the doctor's certificate? Who mails the reassurance letter, and to whom? Each answer sounded civic until it sat next to the others. The steward selected in consultation with donors. The notary held. The exchange kept. The exchange mailed. In a single sentence that sounded like a plea for patience, the steward admitted they were seller, custodian, witness, and courier. Nora stepped forward when Donovan nodded. She took from her sleeve the 2-inch piece of ribbon she had slipped under the knot in the exchange file and laid it on the table beside the steward's tray. The color and weave matched. The wax smear at one end had a crescent where a fingernail had pressed. The steward called that a coincidence. Donovan did not argue. She asked the notary to lift the top slip in the tray with a pair of tongs. The number in pencil on the corner matched the code inside the pawn tin. R12, Chapel Night. The steward said that was an internal filing convenience. The auxiliary women glanced at one another because internal convenience is a phrase people use when they want to make a simple thing look official. The notary decided to take back control by moving fast. He picked up a stamp, his stamp, not the exchange's, and reached for the bond he had just pretended to assign for the demonstration. Donovan put her finger on the stamp rim and turned it so the room could see the metal. The tiny witness bite she had applied to the exchange's stamp was not there. This was the twin he used when he wanted to claim a mistake later. She did not say sleight of hand. She said, "Let us use the instrument in use last night." She took the marked exchange stamp and set it on the pad. The notary hesitated, then pressed. The bite left a nick in the fresh ink. If a second stamp appeared at the next meeting, the absence of that nick would be as loud as a whistle. The doctor's runner tried a different path. He said the exchange protected households from gossip by keeping verification secure. Donovan asked him to name a statute that allowed a private body to control the movement of a person's time by mail. He said the exchange coordinated benevolence. She asked him to define coordination. He said the exchange prevented misunderstanding. She asked him to define misunderstanding. He ran out of words that sounded like charity and set his stack down. The photographer, thinking he could fade to background, made his mistake in the open. He reached under his coat and pulled out a cabinet print already mounted on card and said, "This is the form we show to reassure families." It showed a young woman in front of a velvet backdrop, holding a ledger and looking off the camera. The jaw scar was faint, but there if you knew where to look. Nora looked. She knew. Her breath shortened and then settled. She pointed one finger at the lower corner of the card. The photographer's studio mark had been scraped off and replaced by a blind emboss of the exchange's dove. The exchange did not just file images, it branded them. Donovan wrote as she listened, because a room like this does not keep confession verbatim. It keeps tone. She summarized each admission in a square hand and slid the card across the table for the person to initial if he wanted to deny it later. The notary refused to initial anything. The steward initialed a sentence about coordination in a narrow hand that looked like a schoolboy's. The doctor's runner initialed a line about couriers and then tried to take his mark back when the auxiliary women stared at him. That told Donovan which names would go under seal and which would not. The exchange had one last shot to keep the day from becoming a case. The steward stood and invited the room to remember that households sometimes needed guidance and that young women without fathers benefited from donative order. He said the bond did not sell anyone. It only secured good behavior. He said only men who cared deeply about morality applied for assignment. He did not realize how poorly that last sentence landed in a room full of women who had watched men buy first rights to time with flowered words. The auxiliary matron, who had stayed quiet out of habit, spoke up. She said the exchange had borrowed the auxiliary's name to rent rooms and purchase paper, and that a banner did not make a sale holy. Donovan moved from demonstration to action with 3 steps. She seized the trays, the mark stamp, and the cigar case under authority of the mail statutes, which allow temporary custody of tools used to create or convey instruments that travel by post for the purpose of extracting money. She asked the postmaster to log the seizure with times exact to the minute. She asked the notary to open the tin beneath the table with the small key. He reached for it, found his vest pocket empty, and paled. The key was gone. Nora held it up in 2 fingers so the room could see it. She had lifted it from the cigar case when the notary swapped stamps, the same way he had been lifting rights from files for months. Donovan took the key, opened the tin, and found 3 stacks. Assignments pre-filled with blanks where names could be slotted, blue ribbons cut and labeled by initials, and a bundle of receipts that read, "Receipt of Propriety," with lines for dates and a charge for messenger. Caleb's job became practical when a man in a good coat tried to push open the back door with a private delivery, as if the word private were a badge. Caleb pointed to the ledger and said, "Book first." The man said he had the exchange's permission. The postmaster set a hand on the door and said, "The exchange does not run the United States mail." The man withdrew his hand an inch and quieted down. In the pause, the room recalibrated who could tell whom what to do. Nora did not grandstand. She asked to see the acknowledgment with her name. The notary said the file was confidential. Donovan looked in the tin and pulled out a folded paper with Nora Hale written on the margin in pencil. It was not yet filled in. It was not blank either. The household line carried a faint graphite shadow where another name had been erased. That meant this was not a single buyer and a single bond. It was inventory. Donovan asked for the doctor's certificates tied to Nora's policy. The runner produced an envelope with a blind seal. Inside, a printed form with boxes checked in a hand that was not Avery's. The hand had a diagonal slash on the capital G that Avery's did not. She knew that from license filings. She did not need to prove forgery to make the point she wanted. She asked the runner who fills boxes when the doctor is traveling. He said the exchange clerk helps with clerical clarity. In front of a judge, that sentence would translate neatly into fabrication. She had the photographer open his portfolio. On the third page lay Nora's cabinet print, mounted fresh and embossed with the dove. She turned it over and found a pencil code that matched the pawn tin. She asked the photographer who paid for the extra prints. He said the exchange kept petty cash for exhibits. She asked who asked for the print mounted before assignment. He said the steward liked to be ready. Ready meant pre-selected. With the room quiet, Donovan set out her route map so even the notary could follow. Orphanage ledger to exchange bond. Exchange bond to notary acknowledgement of assignment. Doctor certificate into exchange custody. Photographer's cabinet print branded by exchange. Messenger letters to landlords, employers, and men expressing interest. Mail routes used to move the reassurance and the threat. If you behave, we will protect you. If you question us, we will inform. That is not marriage. That is leverage. The steward tried to insist the post office had invited them to demonstrate. Donovan agreed. She had invited them for this exact reason. To bring the tools into a federal room and show the public what the tools did. She signed the seizure forms and handed the steward a receipt in duplicate. The notary said he would sue. Donovan said he should bring paper with names when he did. On the way out the door, the auxiliary matron stopped by the table and touched the velvet backdrop the photographer had set on a chair. Her gloved fingers came away with a faint trace of red wax where the edge had been sealed for transport. She looked at the glove, then at the women in the room, and said the auxiliary would no longer rent rooms to the exchange until the court decided what a bond meant when it came with a key. Caleb walked Nora home without touching her because the day had made touch feel like a transaction. He told her the bread came out of the oven fine, and he had not burned a single pan while he stood watch in the sorting room. She told him she had stolen a key from a man who believed his pocket was the law. He laughed once and then caught himself because the feeling under the laugh was not joy. It was relief mixed with anger he did not yet know where to put. Donovan did not celebrate. She wrote chain of custody cards for the stamp, the trays, the cigar case, the tin, the cabinet print, and the doctor's envelope. She placed the pawn tin in the center as the originating exhibit. She asked the postmaster to send a wire to the notary's printer requesting records of blank acknowledgments sold in the last 6 months. She asked the clerk at the orphanage for the blue cloth ledger with gifts and dowers written on it and signed for it like it was a money bag. Then she walked to the notary's office before closing and asked the clerk for receipts for the exchange's use of the dove dye. The clerk said the dye belonged to a private society. Donovan asked whether private seals carried the same reporting requirements as corporate seals when used to move instruments that travel by post. The clerk said he was not sure. Donovan said she was. She took the book where robin's egg blue ribbon slides were taped in at the end of each month with tallies. She turned to November. The exchange had used the dye 53 times. The number did not match bonds assigned. It matched letters sent. She closed the book and checked her watch. 9:17. She wrote the minute down. She wrote 2 words next to it. Chapel returns. Nora sat at her table and opened a drawer where she kept threads and needles and a photograph of her mother cut from a larger picture. She set the blue ribbon piece beside it. The same motion, the same habit of keeping small proofs where she could see them when the room went quiet. She was not done. She had eyes on what the exchange had not yet shown. The receipt of propriety slips the buyers like to fold into their wallets. The promise letters the exchange liked to send when a buyer hesitated. Those did not live in tins. They lived in pockets and desk drawers. She would need a way to make a man take one out and show it without knowing why he had done it. She started to think like a person who sells sugar to men who swear they have had enough and then ask for 1 more ounce because the taste of it is already in their mouth. The exchange did not cancel chapel night just because their trays had changed hands for an afternoon. They were too confident and too practiced. Donovan decided to let them try to run it anyway and take what mattered while it moved. She built a small team that did not look like a team. The auxiliary matron asked for her key back and used it to open the side door to the choir room. The postmaster stood at the back pew with his ledger folded into a hymn book jacket. The express boy took a spot by the vestry stair where runners like to come and go. Caleb arrived carrying a bakery box with enough weight to excuse his presence anywhere. Nora came in with her aunt and sat where good girls sit when they are told something is for their benefit and they do not believe a word. Donovan made a control the way you test a machine. She had the orphanage clerk prepare a decoy bond for a fictitious applicant, adult on paper, with an innocuous surname and a blue ribbon cut from a different bolt. She had the printer set a microscopic misalignment in the dove emboss at the cardinal point, so a magnifier would show a tell. She put the control into the exchange's inbox that afternoon with a polite note about a suitor asking for assurance. If the exchange tried to move the control like any other bond, the misaligned dove would mark every paper it touched. The chapel looked like a charity concert without music. A banner said, "Benefit." The velvet backdrop sat rolled in a corner to make the photographer feel useful. A table held water and a tray with smaller brass keys than the ones Donovan had seized, stamped with numbers that matched the penciled codes she had seen inside tins. New stock, not yet in federal custody. The notary had retrieved a second stamp without the tiny witness bite Donovan had pressed into the first one. He rested it near his right thumb and used the exchange's marked stamp only when someone watched. Nora did not wait for a man to choose her. She chose her moment. She recognized a buyer from the grocer's line. Good coat, perfumed handkerchief, a face that smiled at the sound of his own full name. He had asked about the seam room a week earlier, too curious for a stranger. When the steward called a pause to allow the ladies to refresh, Nora walked past the buyer as if she had been sent on an errand and dropped one sentence that sounded like bureaucracy instead of defiance. The shop now requires the receipt of propriety at first meeting. The buyer's reflex was instant. He took a narrow wallet slip from his inner pocket and flashed it the way men flash badges they purchased. Nora did not touch it. She only looked. Receipt of propriety, Series C, custodial right to time and conduct, serial ending in 12. She let her gaze sit on the serial for 1 second too long so he would think she had memorized it. Then she stepped away as if nothing mattered. Caleb blocked the aisle politely with the bakery box and asked the buyer if he would like to send a sweet loaf to the auxiliary as thanks for the evening. The buyer smiled and tucked the wallet slip back in with the awkwardness of someone who has just tried to look official and been forced to act like a guest again. His thumb left a faint flower print on the paper. He did not notice. Caleb did. People talk differently when they are touching food. Caleb asked a harmless question about delivery hours. The buyer answered with a time. He had just given them an address and a window without understanding why his mouth had moved. The notary tried to rebuild rhythm. He called the next name, slid the cigar case open, and reached for a tiny key to pop a tin under the table. The tin held pre-filled acknowledgments with blanks for household names. He kept his left hand over the lower corners where cereals lived and worked fast. Donovan did not stop him. She watched for the control misalignment in the dove emboss. On the third paper, the misaligned bird appeared under the angle of his ring finger. The control bond had been slotted into inventory without a second look. That put the exchange's stamp on a federal test and tied their whole process to a deliberate act. The photographer stepped forward with cabinet prints in a folio, ready to mount another reassurance for a buyer. Donovan asked him to show where the prints were stored between chapel nights. He pointed toward the sacristy as if the question were part of a tour. The auxiliary matron opened the sacristy with her key before he could reach the handle. Inside, a drawer held 6 mounted prints with the exchange's blind emboss pressed over scrape studio marks. Underneath lay 3 glass plates wrapped in church choir sheet music. 2 were of girls no longer in the city. One was Nora, ledger in hand, jaw scar catching light. The matron closed the drawer and said, "We do not keep these here any longer," and took the whole stack because ownership is sometimes that simple. A soft commotion rose near the vestry stair. The express boy whistled once. A man in a choir pin was trying to leave with a cardboard tube bundled like a music roll. The postmaster stepped into the doorway with the hymn book ledger half open and asked for a manifest. The man said church literature. Donovan asked him to open the tube. Inside was not literature. It was a brown cylinder wrapped in paper bearing the exchange code and a faint double halo at its rim. Not a voice. A dictation sample used to sell the idea of proper vows to buyers who liked sound more than words. The man said he was helping with a demonstration. The matron said he was not helping any choir she knew. The steward's response to the pressure was speed. He announced an internal assignment to move 3 bonds at once for households who could not attend. He slid 3 acknowledgments into the notary's reach and tapped a stack of envelopes for immediate mailing, reassurance letters to employers and landlords. Caleb saw the top envelope addressed to Nora's landlady with the phrase "schedule reassurance" on the line where a return address should have been. He lifted the bakery box toward the steward the way a man offers a peace gift, and watched the steward reach for a nib without checking the clock or the ledger. The postmaster cleared his throat. "Book first." The steward froze a fraction of a second and then smiled the kind of smile that insists a rule has always been followed. Nora's aunt did something that changed the room in one motion. She stood and said in a voice that carried without shouting, "Do you tell the girls you sell first rights to their time?" The steward began the sentence he had been saying for a year about donors and dignity. She did not let him finish. "I am not asking about donors. I am asking about a piece of paper that tells a landlord who owns a woman's evening." The auxiliary women did not applaud. They did something better. They shifted their chairs toward the aunt and away from the steward by 2 inches. A room can turn with 2 inches. Donovan let the steward finish one more assignment because she needed the numbers to match the papers in the tin and the keys on the tray. The notary pressed the wrong stamp without the witness bite when he thought no one looked. Caleb saw the absence and touched Donovan's sleeve with one finger. She asked the notary to repeat the press using the exchange's marked stamp for clarity in the demonstration, and the nick from her witness bite appeared in the ink where the law would later see it. She had 2 impressions on the same day with different rims. That was the kind of detail a judge could hold in his hand. The buyer with the perfumed handkerchief grew impatient. He wanted to show he had authority in a room full of women who were no longer performing gratitude. He approached Nora with his wallet slip half visible and said it would be his honor to reassure her employer personally. Nora said evenly that her employer did not require a visit, only a receipt. He took the slip fully out to brag that he had it before other men. She did not reach for it. She said one sentence as if she were tired and needed help. "Would you hold it over the ledger so the postmaster can copy the serial?" He held it over the hymn book jacket and set 2 fingers on the edges, like a man pinning a moth for display. The flower from Caleb's box left a faint print on the corners. The postmaster copied the serial and wrote the time. The buyer thought he had proved something. He had. He had proved chain of custody. The notary saw the tide go out and tried fire instead of paperwork. He signaled the choir man with his eyes toward the sacristy window. The man took the hint and slipped out with a match. The express boy followed him and kicked a coal sack over the weak flame under the sill before it found air. When the man turned back toward the door, Caleb was in the way without looking like a wall. Donovan took the matchbook from the man's hand and read the printer's name on the cover. The same printer who logged the exchange's dove, dye uses. She smiled without warmth. Sometimes the path writes itself. Donovan did not need a raid. She needed a handover. She told the steward the exchange would continue this demonstration at the post office immediately, so the public could learn how benevolence travels. She said it exactly that way to make refusal sound like guilt. She had the postmaster log the trays, the keys, the duplicate stamp, the cigar case, the envelopes, the wallet slip serial, the cylinder with the halo, and the sacristy drawer's contents. She had the auxiliary matron sign as a witness. The matron signed as if she were tying a knot that would not come loose. On the way out, the buyer with the wallet tried to bluff one last time. He said he would withdraw his support if the girl could not show proper gratitude for help. Nora did not react to the bait. She said her gratitude would be to work her hours and keep her letters, and that seemed to confuse him because he was used to sentences that curved toward him at the end. He said he would take his business elsewhere. Donovan said the United States Mail would follow him there too. They moved the whole room down the street. The exchange called it an outrage. The auxiliary matron called it housekeeping. The post office doors closed behind them with the latch sound that makes grown men straighten their backs. The marked stamp went on the table. The duplicate went into a bag. The cigar case went beside it, slit in the lining plainly visible. The sacristy glass plates stood upright in a drying rack like blunt knives. The halo cylinder rested on cotton. The buyer's wallet slip lay under glass. Nora's ribbon piece sat next to the steward's spool. Donovan wrote the first page of the charging document in the quiet that follows a storm when everyone is still hearing themselves breathe. Not obscenity. Extortion by post. Fraudulent use of private seals in instruments conveyed by mail. Conspiracy to assign custodial rights to time and conduct under false description of benevolence. Attempted destruction of records. Use of a religious auxiliary for procurement. She dated it and looked at the clock. 9:20. She wrote the minute down because the beginning of the hour had started this story, and it amused her to mark the end. Caleb set the bakery box on the table at last and opened it. Inside were loaves he had paid for himself, because a room where girls have just watched a price put on their evenings should not smell like ink alone. People ate standing up. The buyer did not stay. The notary tried to. Donovan told him to come back with counsel in the morning. The steward sat very still and looked at the marked stamp as if staring would make the nick disappear. Nora watched the aunt tear the benefit banner down without asking anyone's leave. The auxiliary matron folded it and handed it back to the exchange with a receipt that said, "Return to owner, no further use." Nora put the ribbon piece in her pocket and felt the wax smear against her finger. She had wanted to catch the paper that said receipt of propriety so badly that she had forgotten how many times she had already proved what it was. She did not feel triumphant. She felt steady. That is a different thing, and it lasts longer. The express boy slipped her a note with an address and a time. The buyer's bakery delivery window, courtesy of a boast too big for the room. She nodded once. There would be one more thing to collect in the morning before court. Then she looked at Donovan, who was still writing, and understood that the person who had kept track of every minute would keep track of the last one too. The judge would not call it a morals case. He called it a mail and instruments case and told the clerk to prepare a room with no windows, one long table, and enough chairs for people who thought paper protected them. He ordered that all subjects' names be sealed on the record. He said buyers and officers of the exchange would be named as needed. He told Donovan to show the route, not the outrage. Donovan set the table by sequence. On the left, she placed the blue cloth orphanage ledger marked Gifts and Dowers. Next to it, the chapel tray with small brass keys and the cigar case with a slit in its lining. In the middle, the exchange's marked stamp with the tiny bite on its rim, the duplicate stamp without the bite, and the tin taken from under the notary's table with pre-filled acknowledgments and ribbons cut to initials. On the right, the sacristy drawer contents. 6 mounted cabinet prints with the exchange's dove embossed over scrape studio marks. 3 glass plates in sleeves. The brown cylinder with the faint double halo. The buyer's wallet slip under glass with a flower thumbprint at the corner. And the control bond Donovan had seated, its dove misaligned one hair at the cardinal point. Across the front edge, she lined up the chain of custody cards in a clean square hand. She said the date. She said the minute. Then she sat. The exchange arrived in layers of confidence. The steward came first with a speech folded in his coat. The notary followed with a lawyer and a face that belonged to a man who believed stamps outranked statutes. The doctor's runner carried envelopes and tried to look like a clerk, not a decision. The photographer held his folio like a shield. The buyer with the perfumed handkerchief stood near the door, as if proximity to the exit counted as strategy. The auxiliary matron brought her key and her ledger. Nora sat between her aunt and Caleb. Caleb had left the bakery box with the express boy outside and brought only his cap and a pencil. The judge opened with rules. Subjects would be referred to by initials. No one would handle a cylinder without gloves. No one would speak over anyone else. He looked at Donovan and said, "Show me how money moved." Donovan did not start with the halo cylinder or the scrape studio marks. She started with the blue cloth ledger and the exchange bond. She read one line from the orphanage book, an adult girl by the ledger, a small sum, a bond number, and then laid down the bond with the same number and the exchange's dove. She rested a finger on the phrase custodial right to time and conduct. She did not offer adjectives. She asked the notary to read the same phrase aloud. He tried to call it form language. The judge told him to read. She moved to the chapel process. She asked the steward to describe chapel night. He said it was a benevolence event where donors supported girls. She asked who chose buyers. He said the exchange weighed suitability. She asked who held bonds between selection and assignment. He said the exchange held for safekeeping. She asked who mailed reassurance letters to landlords and employers. He said the exchange coordinated. She put those 4 answers on one card and slid it to the judge. Seller, custodian, selector, courier. The judge wrote one word above them: control She lifted the duplicate stamp and the exchange's marked stamp, set them on ink, and pressed them side by side on a scrap the clerk provided. The nick from her witness bite showed on the marked impression. The duplicate was clean. She called the postmaster, who testified that the marked impression appeared on seizure paperwork at 9:20 the previous night, and the clean impression appeared on a chapel night acknowledgment from the same hour. The notary's lawyer objected over nothing. The judge overruled without looking up. The auxiliary matron testified that her room had been rented under a charity banner and used to store mounted prints embossed with a private seal. She laid her ledger on the table and pointed to lines where the exchange purchased paper and wax under hymnals and incidentals. She said she had found the glass plates in the sacristy wrapped in choir music, and that her glove picked up red wax from the velvet backdrop. The steward called those preparations for modest demonstrations. The matron said her choir did not emboss other women's faces. The photographer tried to reduce his role to paper handling. Donovan put Nora's cabinet print in front of him and asked why the studio mark had been scraped and replaced with the exchange's dove. He said buyers needed assurance of decorum. She turned the card over and read the pencil code that matched the pawn tin and the chapel tray slip. She asked him who paid for mounted prints before assignments. He said the exchange kept petty cash so a buyer could leave with something respectable in his pocket. The judge wrote under petty cash, product. The music hall mechanic explained the halo cylinder in plain words. He showed the first faint double ring made when a pantograph's carriage starts the cut. He set the cylinder on a demonstration mandrel and spun it without the horn, so the ring was visible without sound. He said a halo on the first ring proved duplication. He was not asked to perform. He was asked to point. He pointed. That was enough. The postmaster described the attempt to slide envelopes out the back door at the chapel and the rule he enforced. Book first. He read the top line of the reassurance letter addressed to Nora's landlady. Schedule reassurance. The steward said that phrasing was meant to comfort. The judge asked who had signed the letter. The steward said the exchange signed for the girls. The judge wrote for the girls and underlined it twice. Caleb read from the buyer's wallet slip with the flower thumbprint at the corner. Receipt of propriety, Series C, custodial right to time and conduct, serial ending in 12. He gave the serial and the minute when the postmaster had copied it under the hymn book jacket. The buyer said he had shown the slip to reassure the household. Donovan asked what the slip would be used for if a girl refused to meet unaccompanied. The buyer said the exchange would withdraw support. The judge asked what that would look like. The buyer said a letter to the landlord. The judge wrote, "Letter to landlord," under leverage. The doctor's runner said the exchange's doctor performed neutral examinations and sealed envelopes for the file. Donovan placed one certificate in front of him and asked whose hand had filled the boxes. He said the exchange sometimes completed clerical portions to aid comprehension. She asked him to write a capital G. He made a diagonal slash through the bar. The certificate's G's had no slash. Avery's licensing file, G's did. She did not accuse forgery. She said the file was not complete without the doctor's hand. The judge asked where the doctor was. The runner said traveling. The judge told the clerk to issue a summons and mark the certificate as incomplete. The notary's lawyer made his only passable argument. He said nothing indecent had been mailed, therefore the mail statutes should not apply. Donovan stayed en route. She said the statutes bar using the mail to convey instruments and letters whose value consists in suppressing or disclosing private information against payment. She said the exchange's letters did not need dirty words. They needed the phrase, "or else." She pointed at the calm column equivalent in the exchange receipts, messenger fee, calm achieved, and let the room draw the line from a girl's recorded time to a buyer's improved temper. The steward asked for discretion in the name of households that would be embarrassed by publicity. The judge said subjects' names were sealed and would remain sealed. Embarrassment belonged to buyers and officers who had created the instruments. He ordered all cylinders and mounted prints seized. He suspended the exchange's mail privileges pending indictment. He barred the exchange from using the auxiliaries' room, vouchers, banner, or any seal resembling a public crest. He ordered any private dies surrendered or destroyed under martial supervision. He told the clerk to prepare charges. Donovan read the counts cleanly. Extortion by post, fraudulent use of private seals on instruments conveyed by mail, conspiracy to assign custodial rights to time and conduct under false description of benevolence, attempted destruction of records, tampering with the custody of the mail, unlawful branding of photographic exhibits to imitate official proofs. The notary's lawyer asked for bond. The judge set amounts that sounded like sums the exchange had called donations. Nora testified last, not about feelings, but about acts. She described slipping a ribbon under her file knot, pressing a fingernail into the wax, and watching the notary lift a slip in the chapel tray with a number that matched a code inside a pawn tin. She described asking a buyer to hold his receipt over the ledger so the serial could be copied. She said one thing the judge wrote down, word for word. "You did not give us guardians. You gave yourselves a schedule." The judge issued 3 immediate orders. First, all assignments connected to Series C bonds were void and to be marked canceled across the face in red by the clerk. Second, all receipts of propriety were instruments without force and to be surrendered upon demand. Any attempt to present one would be treated as a threat conveyed by post. Third, all medical certificates would be held under seal. Subjects could petition for destruction after indictment. He told the exchange to produce a full list of donors and buyers under penalty of contempt. The buyer with the perfumed handkerchief whispered to his lawyer. The lawyer wrote a note and swallowed. The auxiliary matron asked permission to speak as a practical matter. The judge nodded. She said the auxiliary would no longer rent rooms to bodies that issued their own seals and called it charity. She placed the velvet backdrop on the table and requested permission to cut it into cleaning rags. The judge said the court had no authority over fabric and smiled for the first time that day. The notary tried one more angle. He said the exchange had been invited to demonstrate at the post office and had cooperated. Donovan agreed and held up the duplicate stamp without the witness bite. She asked the notary to press it alongside the marked stamp for the record. He refused. The judge told the deputy to take the stamp into custody for later comparison. The notary put his hand flat on the table like a man who has just realized his pocket is not the law. Caleb did not ask for anything. He stood back and waited until the judge finished. The clerk handed him a copy of the order canceling Series C, and he folded it into his cap because he did not have a folder and did not need one. Nora asked if she could have her photograph. Donovan said not yet. It was evidence. Nora did not ask for a copy. She asked whether the court would destroy it in front of a witness. The judge said yes. The room emptied the way rooms do when the work is done, and the consequences start. The deputy took the steward, the notary, the runner, and the choir man with the matchbook downstairs, without cuffs and without ceremony. The buyer walked out the side door and discovered that the street knew his face, even if the record did not use his name. The photographer signed an agreement to surrender plates on demand and to stop embossing the dove. The music hall mechanic tied the halo cylinder's tag and told the clerk how to pack it so it would not crack. Donovan packed the table the way she had set it. Stamp, duplicate, cigar case, tray keys, tin, sacristy prints, plates, halo cylinder, wallet slip, control bond, blue cloth ledger. She signed each card, wrote the time, and flipped the last one over to make sure the ink did not smear. She left one thing out of the crate on purpose: the buyer's receipt of propriety under glass. She handed it to the postmaster and told him to put it in the window by the counter with a small printed line beneath it: "Not valid for mail." The postmaster nodded and said he would enjoy that. Nora and the aunt walked home with nothing in their hands except the idea that paper could be made to let go. Caleb stopped at the bakery and wrote tomorrow's schedule on a slate, because a household that has just had a schedule returned to it likes to see its own hours. Donovan carried the crate to the vault and locked it. She did not leave a second key in her vest. She wrote the final entry in the log in the same square hand as the first: voice unfettered, time returned, instrument seized. Then she looked at the clock and finally let the minute matter to no one but her.